So studying dialectic in Hebrew, Aristotle's topics from thought to practice, question mark. In general, the medieval study of Aristotle in Hebrew was largely determined by its Arabic and Latin counterparts. To some extent, this is also true of the study of Aristotle's topics among Hebrew-reading Jews in Southern Europe. Studying this work seems to have made its first appearance in the 12th century, around the time of, or not long after, the advent of the Logica Nova to the studia and universities. Typical of medieval Jewish Aristotelianism, no text of Aristotle's topics was ever translated into Hebrew. Instead, 12th century thinkers turned to an anonymous translation of the first book of Al-Farabi's Book of Dialectic, itself a loose commentary on the first and eighth books of the topics. In the 13th century, this was supplemented by a translation of Averroes's short commentary on the Organon by Jacob ben Machir ibn Tibon, but this work dedicates only a few pages to treating the topics. It was not until the 14th century that Klonimus ben Klonimus of Arles translated Averroes's middle commentary on Aristotle's topics, and study of the work in Hebrew would begin in earnest. Yet, despite its dependence on Arabic and Latin ways of study, the Hebrew study of the topics also differed significantly from the way it was studied in Arabic and Latin. In both Arabic and Latin, the topics was studied with a view to participating in actual debates, even though these debates took on very different forms in Arabic and Latin. In the Hebrew context, in contrast, Aristotelian dialectic does not appear to have been a model for any debates in practice. It was studied, rather, for its theoretical value in constructing certain types of argument. Moreover, at least one thinker, Shem Tov Falakera, seems to have had the topics in mind when constructing two of his philosophical dialogues. Other Jewish thinkers used Aristotelian dialectic to interpret biblical or Talmudic stories and arguments. Yet, when it came to actual debates, medieval Jewish thinkers shied away from the topic's tradition. After a short overview of the role of dialectic in Arabic and Latin debate praxis, we shall turn to the Hebrew readings of the topics in more detail. So, Aristotle's topics was translated into Arabic at least 5 times in the 9th and 10th centuries, and was probably the most widely read book of Aristotle in Arabic. Indeed, the topics appealed broadly to those Islamic theologians who took up the banner of Kalam and who frequently engaged in debate with representatives of other religions, with other mutakallimun, or with members of the general public. Some of these debates did not take place in person, but were written as dialogues. Still, these authors usually strove to make their written dialogues reflect practice. A tradition of studying Aristotle's topics with a view towards such debates emerged in later generations. Even when Kalam practitioners of dialectic did not absorb Aristotle entirely, their extensive discussions of the rules of debate, Jadal, were very much informed by the readings of the topics. Christian scholastics, too, looked to Aristotle's Topica when they considered how to conduct disputations and debates. With the advent of the new logic in the 12th century, Latin schoolmen, particularly of northern France and Great Britain, looked to Aristotle's topics for guidelines for conducting the very basic frameworks of university discussions. These debates are also reflected in written works, the best known example of which is probably Aquinas' Summae, and there are also a large number of handbooks for scholastic debate, which draw on the topics, along with numerous other sources. We'll start with the Hebrew translation of Al-Farabi's Book of Dialectic, which is right here. You can see, and you can look at this. This is a website. I'll give you the link here as well for the edition that I'm preparing. The study of Aristotelian dialectic in Hebrew, however, was not made with a view to debate praxis. This would appear to be true even for the translation of Al-Farabi's Book of Dialectic, which is primarily concerned with setting out rules for debate between a questioner and a respondent. The questioner and respondent take contradictory positions about a widely held universal proposition, such that when one is disproven, the other is found to be true. Al-Farabi dedicates much to discuss the rules and characteristics of respondent and questioner, yet much of the book is also dedicated to the discussion of how much can be inferred through this method. This kind of inference can achieve results without revealing their causes, and so is not a demonstration. Accordingly, while demonstration is to be preferred, dialectical argumentation also has its uses. This view of dialectic is reflected in some detail in the first 19 paragraphs of Al-Farabi's 135-paragraph-long book of Dialectic. These were the only paragraphs translated into Hebrew. This translation was made anonymously, but its distinctive style allows us to trace it to the 12th century, or at the very latest, the early 13th century of the Common Era. Maybe the Common Era as well. It employs a Hebrew terminology that is quite different from that which the Ibn Tibbon family used in the philosophical translations from Arabic. The latter philosophical Hebrew was invented in the 12th century, but became quite dominant by the middle of the 13th century. Accordingly, the translation of Al-Farabi's dialectic was almost certainly before that. The terminology in general is similar to that employed in a number of anonymous translations of various opuscula of Al-Farabi, including De Intellectu and short commentaries on isagoge, categories, the sophistical refutations, as well as a few other logical works. Mauro Zonta and Gal Freudenthal both suspect that these works are from the 12th century. The translation of the dialectic has the hallmarks of being an earlier translation than the others. For one thing, it has many Arabic terms transliterated into Hebrew, some of which have been corrected in some manuscripts. For another, its translation of terminology is uneven and prefers homophonic translations or transliterations in many cases, even where these are clearly misleading. Such homophonic translations, or perhaps transliterations, are more common in the second half of the work. Some very common terms appear properly translated in the first half of the work, but as homophonic terms in the second half. Thus, the Arabic term rai, which was translated dat by the Tibbonites, appears in the dialectic as eitzah in Hebrew in the first half of the work, but as nira in the second half, a Hebrew term with a root cognate to the Arabic rai. To my mind, this suggests that the translator was operating in a context in which very basic terms had not yet been solidified in philosophical Hebrew, and that he sought transliterations, or homophonic terms as placeholders while he sought better terms. After coming up with better terms, he started to replace them in the translation, but never completed this task. If this is correct, then it is likely that this translation is one of the earliest, if not the very first, of the Hebrew translations of Al-Farabi's opuscula, which employed the same terminology with many fewer homophonic terms or transliterations. It is then quite likely that it was made in the 12th century, though we can't really be more precise than that. We cannot rule out that the translator undertook this project with a view to encouraging the formation of actual debates among Jews in a manner akin to the use of the topics in northern France and England. However, there is no reason to suppose this to be the case, and there is no indication of any interest in philosophy among Jews of those areas at this time. If, as would seem more likely, the translation was produced in Southern Europe, then it would not have been produced in a context where the Logica Nova had been fully introduced. It seems more likely that the translator intended to include Al-Farabi's dialectic as part of a collection of logical works of Al-Farabi, as indeed we find it in the manuscripts now. Still, this does not explain why he would start with this work. In any case, we have no evidence that the translation played any part in any kind of debate that took place among Jews. This translation was read, however, and appears today in 10 manuscripts, generally alongside other commentaries on the topics or the other logical opuscula of Al-Farabi. Two of these manuscripts include the same gloss commentary in the margin. And here's an example of one of them. That this gloss commentary was copied at least twice, neither version appears to be the original, suggests that it was written by someone of some importance. The terminology of the gloss commentary is clearly Tibonide and likely reflects an attempt to reconcile this translation with translations of Averroes' logical works, perhaps even with Klonimus ben Klonimus' translation of the middle commentary on the topics. Yehuda Habadersi wrote a commentary on the De Intellectu that also updated the terminology, and he may be the commentator here as well. If he is, then the comments are from the early to mid 14th century, but if it's not him, they could be as early as the late 13th century. In any case, they do not reflect on debate practice, but rather on the logical validity of inferences made about something by negating its contradictory. All right, Shem Tov Phalakera. Shem Tov Phalakera came the closest of Jewish readers of Al-Farabi to applying principles of Aristotle, its Aristotelian dialectic, to debates. His two main dialogues, the Epistle of the Debate and the Book of the Seeker, are largely based on Al-Farabi. In an article that I submitted to Studia Greco-Arabica, I argue in some detail that the Epistle of the Debate follows Farabian principles in laying out a debate between a scholar and a pietist about contradictory positions about the generally accepted claim studying philosophy is forbidden by Jewish law. By posing a series of questions, the scholar is able to get the pietist respondent to admit that this position is incorrect and to adopt the contradictory position, namely, studying philosophy is not forbidden by Jewish law. In fact, the scholar is able to persuade the pietist that studying philosophy is actually the best way to fulfill certain commandments, such as recognizing the oneness of God, which is an example that also figures prominently in Al-Farabi's dialectic. He thereby uses dialogue to turn the scholar toward philosophy and to encourage him to become philosophical. The Book of the Seeker similarly presents someone, known only as the Seeker, engaged in a series of dialogues that concern contradictory positions of generally accepted propositions. The Seeker, searching for wisdom, assumes the role of questioner in dialogues with a wealthy person, a warrior, an artisan, a physician, a morally balanced man, a grammarian, a poet, a believer in the Torah, and then a scientist who is also a religious Jew. In every case, the Seeker's interlocutor defends the position that his way of life is or leads to true happiness. The Seeker takes up the role of questioner and interrogates his interlocutors until he refutes the position of all but the last of them, namely that of the religious philosopher. He then begins to study philosophy. This is a series of dialectical arguments made through dialogues that lead to adopting a philosophical way of life. Both books, then, would appear to use dialectic as arguments for studying Aristotelian science. Moreover, both are likely influenced primarily by Al-Farabi's Book of Dialectic, though it is possible that Al-Phalakera was also influenced here by Averroes' middle commentary on Aristotle's topics, since he was quite fluent in Arabic. Still, both works do not refer to debates that took place in person, but to highly contrived literary devices in which the interlocutors are called by the characteristic that best reflects their position rather than by an actual name. Moreover, they refer to no historical events and to no people alive at Phalakera's time. This generic character serves to emphasize the discussions of generally accepted universal positions, whose contradictories the interlocutors argue. Yet it also highlights that there is no debate praxis underlying these texts. That is, they are neither imitating any actual debates nor advocating that scholars or potential scholars take up these debates. All right, Joseph ibn Caspi. Joseph ibn Caspi, who lived shortly after Phalakera, provides an example of lack of interest in dialectics and the topic tradition in general. Among Caspi's numerous works, all of which have the word silver in their titles as a play on the author's name, which means silver in Hebrew, is a summary of the various works of Aristotelian logic, of the Aristotelian logical organon in Hebrew, known as Tzror HaKesef, bundle of silver. The work is extant in 29 manuscripts and seems to have been quite popular. The work contains summaries of Joseph ben Machir ibn Tibon's Hebrew translation of Averroes' short commentaries on the Isagoge, categories, De Interpretatione, prior analytics, and posterior analytics. It does not include summaries of Averroes' short commentaries on the other works included in the Arabic organon, topics, sophistics, rhetoric, and poetics. Yet it does contain a summary of the anonymous Hebrew translation of Al-Farabi's commentary on Aristotle's sophistical refutations. This work was not only translated in the same series as the Book of Dialectic, it is also explicitly connected to the Book of Dialectic. Indeed, it is not immediately obvious that one could read the second book in the series without having read the first. Indeed, Caspi tells us in the introduction to the bundle of silver, quote, "Indeed, I have omitted collecting here words of dialectic, rhetoric, and poetics because they are not necessary. That sophistical refutations are necessary, while dialectic is not, is highly indicative of Caspi's attitude toward dialectic in general, to say nothing of adopting it for any kind of debate." All right, Klonimus ben Klonimus of Arles. Around the time Caspi decided not to include dialectic in his bundle of silver, Klonimus ben Klonimus of Arles translated Averroes' middle commentaries on Aristotle's topics and sophistical refutations into Hebrew. Klonimus enjoyed the patronage of Robert of Anjou and seems to have sought to complete the translations of the scientific program of Averroes' middle commentaries begun by Jacob Anatoli in the 13th century. Thus, he also translated Averroes' middle commentaries on physics, De Generatione, Meteorologia, and Metaphysica, and long commentaries on the posterior analytics and the physics. These efforts, along with many of his other translations, seem to have been dedicated to having a complete study program of Aristotelian science available to Jews in Provence, Italy, and Spain. Klonimus also wrote an extensive letter to Caspi, preserved in a single manuscript in Munich, which number 307, which is currently being edited and annotated by Hannah Kasher and Gad Freudenthal. Although Klonimus begins with a few words of praise for Caspi, the 13,000-word letter is mostly an attack on Caspi for departing from the great philosophers before him, and especially from Maimonides. Among the criticisms Klonimus levels at Caspi is that the latter is unfamiliar with dialectic. This is manifest inter alia in places in works other than the bundle of silver, where Caspi uses various biblical statements as the basis for syllogistic arguments. Klonimus accuses Caspi of having mistaken the certainty one should attribute to well-known principles. According to Klonimus, although Caspi sought to base his arguments on intelligibles and to avoid premises drawing on what is well known, because he did not know dialectic, says Klonimus, and he turns to Caspi in this, "You fled from hot sand and fell into fiery coals. Barachta min haremetz v'nafalta be'esh pecham." In Hebrew, for those of you who know Hebrew. The issue in particular would seem to be the question of whether prophetic predictions of future events must come true, whether they are good predictions or bad predictions. Maimonides, in his commentary on the Mishnah, had said that prophets should only be judged on the basis of whether their good future predictions come about. Prophecies of future evils may not come about because people can repent and become better, thus no longer deserving evils. Since God is, quote, a God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he. That's Deuteronomy 32:4 in the King James translation. God will not cause evil to fall upon those who have not become good, who have become good. If they have become good, they won't have evil. However, he will cause good, once promised, to befall even those who have become bad. Caspi, however, takes issue with this view in at least 3 of his works: The Tower of Silver, another work, A No Longer Extant Letter to the Sages of Ceylon, and The End of the Silver, that work, which is incidentally his last book. I guess he had no more silver to keep writing. Caspi says that a prophetic prediction is, quote, a universal premise, hakdama kolelet, and its realization is a particular instantiation of that premise. Accordingly, all prophetic premises must come true, even if they are made conditional on certain behavior. Moreover, prophets can be tested as true or false prophets on the basis of whether or not their prophecy comes true. All right, Klonimus counters this. Klonimus counters this with an argument based on Averroes' middle commentary on Aristotle's Topics, which is currently being edited by my doctoral student, Aryeh Reiner. Klonimus says, look, our brother, since I know that you're an expert in the chambers of logic, then you already know the classes of the well-known. Look at this prophetic premise that is in the past in the statement, even if it is made conditionally. How far it is from even the border of what is well known. How much farther it is from being an intelligible or something that becomes clear from an intelligible. For the philosopher explained, or so it appears from the power of his words, that any condition set regarding reward is like a double condition. This is what is stated in the Topics in connection with those topics that are taken from contraries. Doing good to one who is good necessarily entails doing harm to one who is bad. For these are opposites, and one opposite necessarily entails the other. This is the topos. Although its material is well known, it happens to be unintelligible. For there are many premises with this character, as the philosopher explained at the beginning of the Topics. This argument apparently combines a discussion of conditionality in Topics 2-4 and contraries in Topics 5 and 6. The upshot is that if the prophetic prediction says that X will come to be if you are good, and Y if you are bad, and if you are then good, then the occurrence of Y will not be an acceptable outcome. Caspi missed this because he neglected the Topics, and so recognized neither the topical argumentation involved here, nor what was properly among the well-known things. Indeed, these two subjects are at the center of Averroes' middle commentary on the Topics, using well-known propositions as premises of syllogisms and topical arguments based on those well-known premises. We do not have Caspi's response to Klonimus's letter, if he even wrote such a response. Still, it is clear that while this may be said to be a kind of debate between Klonimus and Caspi, it is not a debate that itself employs much topical argumentation, even if Klonimus would require us here to make inferences combining different chapters of the middle commentary on the Topics. Klonimus does not seek to apply topical argumentation to his own debate, but rather to apply it to the Bible. That is, there is no praxis for medieval disputations based on the Topics, but a literary method of interpreting the Bible and for applying its messages to the world. All right, so commentators on of the translation of Averroes' middle commentary on the Topics. So Levi Gersonides, who lived from 1288 to 1344, wrote a commentary on Averroes' middle commentary on Aristotle's topics around 10 years after Klonimus finished translating it. His commentary survives in 2 manuscripts, both of which are badly damaged and hard to read. Still, it seems that he is primarily guided by Averroes' theoretical concern vis-a-vis well-known propositions, topical argumentation in general, and argument by induction. Todros Todrosi of Arles, born 1313, supplemented Klonimus's translation of the middle commentary with various translations of works, including the long commentary on the topics by Al-Farabi. In the latter, as Daniel Davies and Alex Lamprakis, who is, I believe, here, have shown, Todros is particularly interested in discussing the philosopher's use of dialectic for persuading the public to pursue happiness as much as they can. In such use, the philosopher becomes closer to the ideal philosopher king. Another probably 15th century anonymous commentary is found in Munich Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, Hebrew manuscript 26. The commentator is particularly interested in the political ramifications of topical argumentation, but with a view to convincing or even deceiving the public. He does not seem at all interested in debate with the public square, parliament, or any other institution. All right, finally, I want to mention a short poem appended to a manuscript containing Klonimus's translation of the middle commentary on the topics, written in a Provençal Hebrew script in 1403 and found in Munich Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, Hebrew manuscript 284 on folio 90V. The poem, which may be the product of the scribe who's identified as a Judah ben Solomon, is as follows. I have entered into the book of the topics, as into an orchard where plants flower. Among them is the tree of knowledge in its spring. Its fruits are wet and moist. May God grant me to merit their leaves in studying it, that is, in studying the topics. Through it, may my eyes be always opened, and may it serve as the surviving remnant of my inheritance forever and eternal everlasting. The poet here describes the Topica as a fruitful orchard, an image associated with heaven and the attainment of intellectual knowledge of God in Maimonides' guide. He looks to the book, to the topics, for eye-opening enlightenment. His reference to the surviving remnant of my inheritance suggests, though, that he recognizes that it is not the full attainment of intellectual knowledge, but one that he can attain in his less than perfect state. Nevertheless, he seeks to make this enlightenment eternal and everlasting. This is a play on the Hebrew words netzach netzachim, eternal everlasting, and nitzuach, which means dialectic, or which is used for dialectic. I believe that this poetic language suggests that he, too, like Klonimus in his letter to Caspi, would use dialectic to interpret the Bible, to understand the divine things depicted therein, and thereby to move closer to an intellectual understanding of God. That is, closer to this orchard. Okay, conclusion. Hebrew-speaking Jews of the Middle Ages may have received their texts of the topics from Muslims and Christians, but there is no indication that they ever sought to structure debates based on rules they saw in the topics in any kind of institutional setting or even informal study setting. Rather, they turned to the topics to discuss rules of inference and claims that they could make based on things about which they did not have demonstrative knowledge. The Bible and theological issues were such claims, and for some, Aristotle's topics provided a lens with which to view them. I believe this use of the topics and topics commentaries is distinctive to Southern European Jews of the Middle Ages to early Renaissance. So thank you very much for your attention. And I welcome any questions or comments.